Hello, I hope you're well. Welcome back to my channel, and welcome to today's video, which is my quarterly bookish bracket, which is literally the only type of bracket I would ever be able to do because I know zero zilch goose eggs about sports. But this video was inspired by something that I saw going around Bookstagram at the beginning of the year, and I figured I would turn it into a video series for my channel, where effectively each quarter I go through my favorite books of the quarter and debate with myself on camera which one is my favorite of the last few months. And in the process, I might have a nervous breakdown because I don't know about you, but it is very hard to decide on just one book that is a favorite. But before I get into all of that chaos, I like to give a little bit of a stats update on what's been going on for the last few months. So I'm talking about the books that I've been reading in April, May, and June. So the second quarter of the year. So for this quarter, I read a total of 24 books, and that's just a little bit down from Q1 when I believe I read 29 books. But if you break that down further and you look at the nonfiction to fiction ratio, it is 22 fiction to 2 nonfiction, which when you actually look at the numbers is not great. But I kind of knew that going into this because I was feeling more of an affinity towards fiction this last quarter. However, because I do have a reading goal to read 23 nonfiction books this year, I'm trying to emphasize reading nonfiction in Q3 and Q4, which is part of why my summer TBR has so many nonfiction titles on it. But if we look and do like a deeper dive into that genre breakdown, we see a slightly different story. So we see that I read 9 genres total, which I think last quarter I read 7 total, and the breakdown here is 5 historical fictions, 2 nonfictions, which I've already mentioned, 1 YA, 3 speculative fictions, 2 classics / modern classics, 3 contemporary, 5 romance, 2 plays, and 1 mystery. And I realized in kind of doing this breakdown that genre is very subjective. Like, a lot of these books are cross-genre and could fill like different genre categories if I really dug deep into it. So this is my subjective take on where these books fell. And then if you look at format, I had 7 audiobooks and 17 physical books total. But now we get to the star ratings, and star ratings are key here because what I end up doing is taking the books that I gave 5-star ratings to the book bracket, because these are the books that I rated most highly and theoretically are the ones that I enjoyed the most. So if you look at the books that I read over the course of the last 3 months, I had 1 book that I did not rate, and that's because I DNF'd it. Not DNF'd it forever, but I decided to put it aside for now because I just couldn't get into it at the time I was trying to read it. Then I had 1 2.5 star, 8 3-star, 6 4 stars, 3 4.5 stars, and 5 5 stars. So if you actually look at this, I think this is 14 books total that I rated 4 stars or higher, which means that over half the books that I read in the last quarter were fabulous and fun rides for me. So that's not doing too shabby, right? I don't think so. And now we get into the book bracket, which, as I mentioned, I take the books that I gave 5 stars and put them into the bracket as contenders. But what I need to do is whittle down the books to 3 semifinalists, then 2 finalists, and then ultimately 1 favorite read for the quarter. And I've kind of created some criteria that I like to use, questions I can ask myself to help me get to that decision. But part of it too is also just like gut feeling, and that actually is one of the criteria. So we'll go through this process. So, the books that are in consideration for my favorite book of Q2 are Abigail by Magda Szabo, and this is considered YA because of the age of the protagonist, but I'm actually considering it a modern classic because of when it was written. It is a translated work from Hungarian. Then we have Deep Blue Sea by Terence Rattigan, which is a play written, I believe, in the 1950s or maybe late 1940s, and that is a play about this woman Hester and sort of the fallout of a failed love affair. That is a very vague sort of elevator pitch on it, but there you go. Next, we have Things in Jars by Jess Kidd, and this is what I considered speculative fiction. It is set in Victorian England, and there is this child with special abilities, allegedly, who is kidnapped, and the main character, Bridie, is trying to get to the bottom of it, and some other goings on in this world. And then there is Carol by Patricia Highsmith, which also is known by the title The Price of Salt, and this is like a classic LGBTQ plus title written in the 1950s, and it recently, I think, came kind of back into modern culture and modern, like, thought. That's not what I'm trying to say. Words, not my friend today, but there was a movie that came out a few years ago with Cate Blanchett and Rooney Mara that kind of brought this work to the forefront once again. And then there is Catherine the Great by Robert K. Massey, which is a biography on Catherine the Great of Russia. So those are the 5 titles that are in contention right now. Before I go any further, I just want to say 2 things. First of all, that I will link my Q1 book bracket in the cards for you, and my Q1 favorite was The Revolution of Marina M. by Janet Fitch. So we're gonna see what is potentially going up against that one at the end of the year when I take my 4 quarterly favorite reads and duke it out between them. So that'll be fun. Not really. It'll be fun for you to watch, not fun for me to try to decide. But yeah, so why don't we just get into the criteria? So I have 6 to 7 criteria that I use to decide and try to whittle these 5 down to 3 semi-finalists. And the first criteria is to remove any rereads from the list. And I do that because if I'm rereading something, it's something that I really loved in the first place. It's probably a favorite of mine, so that always feels a little bit like putting my foot on the scale and doesn't seem fair to the other books. So I like to remove those. However, none of these books were rereads for me. They were all new reads for me. And yeah, so this criteria does buckus to help me in narrowing this down. So we're off to a fantastic start. We are still with the 5 titles. Okay, cool, fantastic. Alright, so then my next criteria is, will I read another book by the author? Great. Great, 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 great. Because I don't think this one helps me either. So, we're gonna, methodically, we're gonna go through the titles. So, Magda Szabo's Abigail. Magda Szabo is an author who is currently kind of in the running to become a new favorite author of mine. Abigail is actually the 2nd book of hers that I have read, and I have a 3rd book of hers, Isa's Ballad, that I do want to read, potentially for Women in Translation Month in August or in the near future. There's something about her writing style that I really enjoy, something about her like very character-driven stories that I particularly enjoy, and I think she does some amazing things with relationships between women, at least from the books that I have read of hers thus far. So the answer to that question is yes, I do intend to read another Magda Szabo book. So, there we go. Then we have Terrence Rattigan, who wrote The Deep Blue Sea, the play. So I do know that he has quite a few plays out there based on reading like the, I guess the preface to the play. One of them I know of, Separate Tables? Separate Places? One of those. And I know it because there's a film adaptation of it with, I think, Rita Hayworth and Deborah Kerr from a million years ago, that I've seen. Didn't realize it was a Terrence Rattigan play until after I'd learned more about Terrence Rattigan. But I'd be interested in reading that. And then there's also another one, I think it's called The Winslow Boy, and there's another film adaptation for it that is more recent, but when I say more recent, probably in the last 30 years. And so those are two of his plays that I would be very much interested in reading, because his dialogue is sharp. Like, I love it. It's very, very intelligent. So I'd be interested in reading either of those. Probably Separate Tables first, because that's the one I know a little bit more about. But yeah, so I do have intentions to read more of his plays. Then we have Things in Jars by Jess Kidd. And yes, like, oh my god, yes to this, because my year would be made, I kid you not, if Things in Jars was the beginning of a series with Bridie as the protagonist and all sorts of weird things happening in Victorian England in this universe. Like, it would literally make my year, because she is such a fun character. She's eccentric. There's a lot of like misfits that kind of are drawn to her and create this really interesting found family. And it was just a lovely time and a lot of fun. It was a really quick read for me. So I would love to see more of Bridie and her friends and all of that. I don't know that Things in Jars is meant to be the start of a series. That's just wishful thinking on my part. But I do know that Jess Kidd does have another book. I think it's called Himself, potentially, and that one is actually set in Ireland. I don't know much about it, but considering how much fun I did have with Things in Jars, I would definitely be interested in reading that one. Then we have Carol by Patricia Highsmith, which is interesting because I didn't realize that the same author of Carol was the one who wrote The Talented Mr. Ripley. And I think part of that is because when Carol was first published under the title The Price of Salt, Patricia Highsmith was using a pen name because she didn't want to be labeled or marked as like a lesbian author. So she used a pen name. I think it was Claire Morgan for Price of Salt slash Carol. So I didn't put two and two together with Carol and Talented Mr. Ripley, but I feel like The Talented Mr. Ripley is one of those like modern classics that I should read and that I would probably enjoy. So I do want to get around to it at some point. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily the highest priority for me, but it's definitely a book that I've now started seeing like literally everywhere. And so it's going to happen sooner or later. And then lastly, we have Robert K. Massey, who wrote Catherine the Great, the biography. And I think his like area of expertise is the like Romanov dynasty in Russia. So I think he has a few biographies. I know there's one on Peter the Great, which I'm not as drawn to. Like, Peter the Great is a fascinating character, but as far as like monarchs in Russia goes, I tend to be more drawn to the females of the Romanov line. So that one, I'll probably read it eventually. Not one that's, again, super high priority. But in preparing for this video, I did realize that he has a biography on Nicholas and Alexandra. who are the last Tsar and Tsarina of Russia, so Anastasia's parents. And I would be very intrigued about that because from what I know of them, like there's a lot going on. I think there's kind of like, theirs was actually a love match, so there's a bit of a romance element to it, but they're also ruling Russia at this really tumultuous time leading up to the revolution of 1917 when they are murdered by the revolutionaries. So I would be really interested in reading that one. I feel like I don't hear anyone talk about that one, though. Like, if you hear Robert K. Massey, it's usually in relation to Catherine the Great's biography. But I am fascinated with that time period with Nicholas and Alexandra, or Alexandria. I see it both ways. But yeah, I would be interested in reading that one at some point. So basically, once again, I have not been able to eliminate any of these 5 books. So we're really, really off to a great start. So we're not doing too hot here, truth be told. But the next kind of criteria in my line of criteria is gut feeling, which I feel like will be the reason I finally remove something from this list. Something from these 5 books. And I really enjoyed all of them. Like, that is why they are 5 stars. Like, these are such amazing books, each and every one of them. But I think if I'm going to go with my gut feeling, I'm going to remove Deep Blue Sea, which is the play. And that's not because I didn't love it. I think the level of, like, human emotion, the wit and sharpness of the dialogue and the characters, especially Hester, are phenomenal. But the reason that I feel like my gut is telling me to remove this is because ultimately it is a play. And ultimately, as a play, the best form to, like, take this in is on stage. Like, that is what it's made for you to see it, to see the characters moving in a physical space and interacting with one another and conversing with one another. And there are some fabulous, like, productions of this available. I know the National Theatre in London actually has the adaptation of this with Helen McCurry, may she rest in peace, available for renting and streaming on their service. And there is a movie adaptation with, who is it? I think it's Rachel Weisz and Tom Hiddleston that is on Amazon Prime that is also pretty good. So I do feel like this is something that is meant to be consumed on the stage in a production. So for that reason and that reason only, we're removing it from the running, which means that we're now down to 4 books, thank God, because I don't know what I would do if the criteria I had created didn't work. I suppose I would just create more criteria. But regardless, we are now down to 4. So the next of these criteria is, did it make you think / feel? For me, when I read a book, which I think is just a personal preference, I tend to be drawn to books that deal with heavier topics. I prefer dramas and tragedies. I really enjoy books that teach me things, whether it is nonfiction and that's kind of the intent, or whether it's fiction and I'm learning things kind of more organically through the issues that are raised, the human interactions, whatever the case may be. But for me, that is really important. So if we look at the books, we have Abigail, which is the Hungarian translated work. It's set in World War II in Hungary. The main character, Gina, is like 14 14, 15 years old, and her father is a general, and he ends up sending her to this like conservatively religious boarding school, where she gets into hijinks with her classmates and peers. But it was interesting to me because part of the book is kind of like fantastical in that the Abigail of the title is actually this statue on the premises of the school, and the reason she is so important is because the girls at the school have this sort of tradition or legend around her that if you write a note to Abigail when you're in distress, she will help you, essentially. So there's this like fanciful element of it with young girls who have this like guardian angel type figure, and then also play all these games where they like marry themselves to inanimate objects at this all-girls school because they're 14, 15-year-old girls. Like, it's not all that much different from MASH or MASH-up. But then there's this other part of the story where it is set in World War II in Hungary, and you're getting a sense of what the political climate is in Hungary at that time, which was really interesting to me because there's certainly a level of like paranoia going on, and I really knew nothing about that, and it made me really curious to learn more of what was going on in Central / Eastern Europe at this time, because I do feel like there is a fixation on sort of Western Europe with England and France and Germany, and like even if you go really far east to Russia, like there's a fixation there. But this was like a country and an experience that was new to me. So that was interesting. If you look at Things in Jars by Jess Kidd, I would say that this one, it was fun. Like, it was really heartwarming and interesting despite some of the like more gothic and paranormal elements, because the characters were so heartwarming and interesting. Like, I really loved the character of Bridie, as I've said, and I've loved the world that was created, but it is more on the paranormal side. It is more a book that has like an entertainment value, perhaps more so than like a thinking, stirring type emotional response, perhaps. So this one is on the fence. I did really, really enjoy it, but it was more that it was a fun read, a fast read, something that like I could escape into effectively. So there were feelings there for sure, but it was more of an escapist type read. Then we have Carol, which is this romance between these two women living in the 1950s. Therese, who is younger, and then Carol of the title, who is a slightly older housewife. Like, older, she's probably realistically in her 30s or maybe early 40s. So, but yeah, so the story is effectively their romance in the 1950s in New York. It involves a road trip across America and just these really interesting characters. But I think for me, what is really interesting about this book, beyond the characters, beyond the character-driven story, beyond the writing, which I think is absolutely stunning, is actually the social impact that this story has had. And it's so important to sort of this like LGBTQ canon, from what I've read, because of the way it ends, and because of the way that Patricia Highsmith didn't use like the stereotypes that were used in this sort of like lesbian romance in the 1950s when she was writing it. Like, she kind of blew it all out of the water. So the book was really, really popular when it first came out for that reason, and has kind of continued to have an impact now because of the movie and everything else. So I think knowing that history and reading it at the same time, it made me kind of more clued in to how unique the story was for the time period in which it was written. So that to me was really interesting. And then Catherine the Great, it's a biography. It's nonfiction. So with nonfiction, I feel like you're always meant to learn something, whether it's like facts and like about history or about another person's experience. Like, that's kind of the nature of nonfiction to me, and I do feel like this accomplished that. Like, my connection with Catherine the Great was intensified in reading more about the experiences she had with people in her like inner circle, but also people's reaction to her from other places of power and within society. But I also, even as someone who studied Russian history and focused more on Imperial Russia, like, I learned a lot about the Russian Empire under Catherine the Great during this time period. So yes, it did certainly make me think, and I think most nonfiction is meant to do that. So, I mean, of the 4 books we're talking about here, the one that I feel like is on less even footing, the one that I can't like gush effusively about having some sort of impact on my perception or my emotions, unfortunately would have to be Things in Jars. Because as I said, that was more of an escapist read for me, and I really enjoyed it, and we all need that at times, but it's not a book that necessarily made me think or wonder about what life in Victorian England was about, because yes, it's set there, but it's also set in like this Victorian England where there are crazy paranormal things that are happening. So yeah, unfortunately, I think that's the one that is gonna go here, unfortunately. So that means our semi-finalists are Abigail, Carol, and Catherine the Great, which, funnily enough, are all books named after people. So let's trudge on, because I need to whittle this down to 2 finalists now, which, so the next criteria, which will hopefully help me whittle this down to 2, is character magnetism. And I mean, for me, this is about whether I feel a connection with the characters that is particularly strong, partly whether I liked the characters themselves, but primarily like how much do I want to be in this character's world? Like, am I drawn to them? So it's funny because of the 5 books that I started with, the characters that I would say I am most drawn to, the ones that I really, really love, are in the books that I already eliminated. So as I've talked about, like, Bridie in Things in Jars is amazing. I love her. I want more of her. Please, Jess Kid, if you're watching this video, give me more Bridie. And also Hester in The Deep Blue Sea. I loved her as a character. She is really complex and tragic, and she goes through hell, but the sort of metamorphosis that she like goes through and where she ends at the end of the play is just really, really satisfying. And so I really loved those 2 characters. But when we look at the 3 books that are still in consideration, I don't feel the same way necessarily about them. Like, if I look at Abigail, Gina is a spoiled brat. Like, she is really, really obnoxious, and there's a reason I don't read YAs, because I tend to find teenagers really obnoxious. I will admit the fact that I was an obnoxious teenager. Like, it's just an age group that I don't enjoy. So while I really love the story, her as a character, she was very entitled, she is impulsive and reckless, and just like what you would expect of a 14-year-old. So I don't necessarily feel any like way about her. I'm not drawn to her. I'm not attracted to her as like someone I'd want to be friends with or invite to dinner. Like, you know, that question in the by the book section of like the New York Times book review where it's like, which 3 authors would you invite to dinner, dead or alive? Like this, like if I were inviting a character, it would not be Gina. Let's put it that way. And then if you look at Carol, they're not unlikable characters, but they're also really, really flawed. Like Therese starts out this book very, very immature. And yes, she does mature thanks to her relationship with Carol and what they go through, but her immaturity is off-putting to me. Like, it's not something that I'm attracted to in characters or in people, to be quite honest. And then Carol is interesting because she is kind of this very elegant housewife character in the 1950s sense, and she's married to a man and she has a daughter and she like wears fur coats and like her hair is always in place and like she's very glamorous, very, very glamorous, but she's also a character that is particularly mercurial. Like, she lashes out for seemingly no reason at Therese. And I mean, seemingly no reason, but also like this is a character that is being repressed by her society and is very aware of it. She's also aware of what she would need to sacrifice in order to be herself in this world. And so you could see how it could make her bitter or make her temperamental or give her this sort of like difficult personality to cope with, because essentially she is a woman who knows that she is queer and she's living in a society where that is not really condoned, and if she wants to be out to the world and be herself, then she has to effectively give up her child and her marriage and the life that she has built thus far. But if she wants to keep her husband, her child, and all of that, she has to continue to repress who she is and hide who she is. And so she's not the most lovable of characters, but there's reason for her behavior. But yeah, neither of them are characters that I would particularly want sitting at my dining room table. And then lastly, Catherine the Great. This is weird because she is not a character. She is a like actual historical figure, and this is non-fiction, but Catherine the Great has been a historical girl crush of mine for years and years and years and years. Like, she was probably one of my first historical girl crushes, to be quite honest, like when I coined that expression. And this book not only solidified that, but it made me like fall even more in love with the woman that she was and her historical significance and just everything that she was able to accomplish in her life. And I mean, this is someone who started out as a lowly like German princess, didn't know the Russian language, wasn't part of the Orthodox religion, moves to Russia as like a teenager, learns the language, converts, becomes really popular among the people, deals with a very difficult husband, comes to power in a coup, tries to like modernize Russia with like warm water ports and getting rid of serfdom, although she doesn't accomplish that, but making it the center of art and culture, like moving it forward, and just everything that she was able to accomplish, and her like logic behind it. It was just really, really interesting. So, I mean, of the three that are sticking around, like, Catherine the Great is definitely moving forward. So she's definitely going to be in the finalist round because I adore her. Like, honestly adore her. But as for the other two, I'm going to go with my gut here because I don't know what else to do at this point. But I'm going to say I'm going to keep Carol by Patricia Highsmith. And that's just because, like, Carol herself is an interesting individual because of what she represents. And, like, the more I spoke through, like, her issues and why I don't necessarily find her the most likable character, is the more that I am actually interested in her character and would be interested in potentially doing a reread and really paying closer attention to what she's saying, but also what she's not saying. Like, what is the subtext to these moments when she lashes out? But now I am actually quite interested in her, because the character that's in the movie feels slightly different than the character that is in the book. So if you're going based on the Cate Blanchett model, like, she looks like I envision Carol, but the behavior is slightly different. But basically, in talking to you guys, the camera, through my issues with Carol, I've decided I like Carol. So maybe I need to do that for Therese. Like, maybe I need to do a deeper dive into Therese in the future. But yeah, so Abigail is gonna go, unfortunately, because I really do like that book. But that means that we are down to the finalists, which are Carol by Patricia Highsmith and Catherine the Great by Robert K. Massey. So my final criteria, which I feel like is gonna need a little bit of modification here, because I feel like my criteria were really intended for fiction, and so the fact that I have a non-fiction title here poses a bit of a conundrum. So I feel like I might need to tweak this last criteria and or potentially go a little bit more with my gut, to be quite honest. So we'll see. But the criteria that I currently have in place is this book immersive or transportive in any way? So it's funny because I think in Q1 I was also down to a modern classic versus another book. And I think that some of the same, like, talking points, the same arguments I made for The Street in Q1 also apply here. In that Carol was written as a contemporary piece of fiction, which means that Patricia Highsmith wasn't necessarily concerned with building a world, because she was writing for the people of the moment, like her contemporaries. So it's not a book that has a lot of, like, world building, because it's just kind of assumed that the reader is part of that society and culture, in some way, shape, or form. So if you're looking at, like, world building elements, Carol isn't it. And the same thing can be said about nonfiction with Catherine the Great. Like, you're not concerned so much about world building as, like, creating enough context for the reader to be dangerous so that they can understand why the character, why the person, rather, is making the decisions they're making throughout their life. Why they end up where they end up. So, in the sense of being, like, immersive or transportive, neither of them are really intended to be necessarily. Like, I don't think that is the goal. So I don't even know if it's a fair assessment of either of these books, to try to whittle them down based on that. And I could be really wrong when it comes to the nonfiction. I mean, hell, I could be really wrong when it comes to my take on Carol, but this is just like my personal opinion here. So I feel like this criteria doesn't work. I don't feel comfortable eliminating either of these books based on that criteria, or based on what they have or what they're lacking for this criteria. So in this case, I do think that it needs to be a gut feeling. Like, I honestly can't think of another criteria that would make sense, because it's kind of like comparing apples to oranges. Like, one is a fiction and one is a nonfiction, and what do you do? Like, what do you do? I don't know. Does anyone know? Anyone? Bueller? So yeah, I think I'm gonna have to go with my gut here, and if I go with my gut, the book I would choose is Catherine the Great by Robert K. Massey. And I mean, this was a book that I described as being one of the easiest 5-star ratings I have given a book, probably ever. I already had an affinity towards her character and this person in history, but I gained such insight into her and into her motivations and into the world she was living in, and sort of the obstacles she had to overcome to become who she was. And I think in the book it actually explains towards the end that Catherine became Catherine the Great like 5 or so years into her reign. Whereas Peter the Great, by comparison, it was decades into his reign, or something like that. I would have to double check, but I remember that like the like too long didn't read it version is that Catherine became Catherine the Great significantly sooner in comparison to Peter the Great. And I think that just goes to show how much she accomplished. I mean, this is someone who now, like, there are 2 recent shows. There's the one with, which Fanning is it? One of them that's on, like, Hulu, and then there's the Helen Mirren one that came out on HBO at almost exactly the same time, and she's just this figure that is, like, I feel like almost everyone has heard of, even if they don't know anything about her. But I just felt like helplessly in love with this historical figure and everything that she was able to accomplish, and she's really just like a badass. So, I mean, yeah, like, I loved reading about her, and I think Robert K. Massey did a really good job about writing about her. So that, I think that's the answer to that, because as much as I really love Carol, as much as I want to reread it at some point, like, my gut is telling me that I preferred Catherine the Great. And yes, I do realize it, like I said, it's comparing apples to oranges, because one is a fiction and one is a nonfiction. But we need to end up with one book, and so I'm sticking with Catherine the Great. Final answer. Okay, I need to stop because this has hurt my head. But anyway, yeah, we have a winner. So we have Catherine the Great as my Q2 book, and we have Marina M as my Q1 book. What's Q3 gonna look like? What about Q4? Nobody knows. Only time will tell. But yeah, I do hope you enjoyed this video. I would love to know what you think your favorite book was from April, May, and June. Like, let me know in the comment section. But if you did enjoy this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye!